Welcome to the Screencast for Scientific Inquiry by Carl G. Hempel. In our textbook, this starts on page 60. So Carl Hempel, he's the man in the photograph on the top right, was a philosopher in the 20th century. He lived from 1905 to 1997. He was a philosopher of science. He was born in Germany, but he spent much of his life in the United States. He taught at Princeton for 2 decades. He also taught at CUNY for a few years, and eventually he became a naturalized citizen. When he was doing his undergrad degree, he studied philosophy, physics, and mathematics. So he was really looking, remember, when we talked about the very first article of what is philosophy, he thought about what fundamentality was. And he thought of physics and science and mathematics as something more fundamental to the way we think and the way the world is than maybe some other areas of questioning. And if you also remember, in the beginning of the semester, I realized it was only a couple of days ago, but one of the earlier screencasts, we talked about the major branches of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ethics, and then how there were more specializations that you could do underneath those different types of philosophy. So if you want to be a philosopher of science, you are doing epistemology, or the study of knowledge. But human beings, of course, have lots of different areas of knowledge, so you can apply the tools and the methodologies of philosophy to specific branches of knowledge as well. So in this article, Carl Hempel is trying to explain a little bit more in depth about what scientific reasoning is and how you might go about testing a hypothesis. So this also links into our reading about different types of reasoning: deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, inference to the best explanation, and scientific inquiry or reasoning. Instead of starting with the technical stuff, he gives a detailed case study of this practice of hypothesis testing in action. And he talks about the Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian doctor who lived in the 19th century, specifically from 1818 to 1865. So, right around when he was a young physician, it was common knowledge that diseases could be spread from person to person, but nobody really knew how it happened. They didn't know the mechanism of disease transmission. There was no such thing as germ theory. There were some rumblings about microorganisms, but it was not a widespread or accepted theory. And that's all germ theory is, that microorganisms are what cause disease. So he was working at Vienna General Hospital, and the hospital was having an extended outbreak of a disease called childbed fever, which was universally fatal for the mother and sometimes the child. And he had noticed that there were 2 divisions in the maternity ward, and in the first division, the rates of death from this disease were much higher than the ones in the second division. So you can see in 1844 it was 8.2 versus 2.3, 6.8 in 1845 versus 2.0, and 11.4 versus 2.7 in 1846. So of course you wonder why the rates are so drastically different. It keeps happening year after year, and it's a big enough percentage to not just be an anomaly. So he began a series of structured observations to try and figure out why this was happening. So, first, he thought about the more common theories as to how a disease like this could take hold in a population. And so one of them was epidemic influences, so-called. They were vaguely described, Hempel says, as atmospheric cosmic telluric influences or changes. So the weather, basically, or whatever was happening in the environment. But he reasoned through this and said there's no reason that a global cause would focus on one of the wards and not the other ward. Also, there had been some cases in which a woman didn't quite make it to the hospital, so she gave birth in the streets, in a cab or a cart, and these women did not die of the childbed fever. So you would think if they were actually outside of the hospital in the middle of whatever environmental factors were causing it, then they would have it more, not less. So he dismissed this idea of epidemic influences. Another hypothesis that was postulated by some was overcrowding. If there were too many people in the maternity ward, maybe that's how they were passing the disease to one another somehow. But when the higher rates of childbed fever and death got out into the population, people were actually avoiding ward number 1 so that it was much less crowded than ward number 2. But the higher levels of contraction of the disease still persisted. So he dismissed that hypothesis. Then they thought, well, maybe it has something to do with the diet or the general care of the patients. And since Ward 1 and Ward 2 got the same diet, that part was thrown out. But there was a difference in the way that the women in the wards were treated. In the first division, it was medical students and their overseers. And in the second division, it was midwives. So the idea was maybe that the doctors in training didn't have a great bedside manner and they were too rough. But when they looked at how the midwives treated the women, it ended up being about the same. So that could also be dismissed as a reason for the difference in the disease rates. I guess the injury goes underneath that as well. So now, if these maybe more straightforward explanations turned out to not be the case, they thought, or Semmelweis thought, well, maybe there's a psychological explanation. So the postulation was that in the second division, it was relatively isolated, but in the first division, whenever somebody passed away from the disease, the priest that came to give them last rites had to walk in front of all of the other patients. So somehow this was doing so much damage to the women's psyches that it was aiding them to succumb to the disease. And now this one, of course, they could rearrange the way the priest entered or gave last rites to the women who were dying. And they did, and it didn't change the rates of contraction. So we keep throwing up these hypotheses and knocking them down. So in 1847, Semmelweis had a bit of a breakthrough. A colleague of his passed away after he was punctured during an autopsy with the scalpel of a student. So Semmelweis observed him as he contracted symptoms that looked a lot like the same symptoms from childbed fever. So he had this idea that because the scalpel had opened a pathway into his bloodstream, something passed into his bloodstream from the scalpel itself. So we're getting closer, right? Even though there's no universal idea of a germ theory, he postulated that it was cadaveric matter. So instead of a cursory hand wash, he prescribed lime sorter or lye. I don't even remember which one it is. Let's see here. This is on page 62. Chlorinated lime before making an examination after an autopsy. So you can imagine that before this discovery happened, these medical students were performing autopsies to learn about anatomy and physiology, and they were just rinsing their hands with water and then immediately going to the maternity ward and delivering babies. So once this protocol was put into place where they had to wash with chlorinated lime, the mortality rate fell to 1.27%. So compare it to the other one, 1.33. So data that also had previously been collected was explained by this new cadaveric matter hypothesis. The women that had given birth in the street, of course, they wouldn't contract the disease if they'd never come into contact with this cadaveric matter. And then the babies who actually caught the disease along with the mothers it made sense because the bloodstream came into contact with the same cadaveric matter. So later on he expanded it. It wasn't just cadaveric matter, it was also putrid matter derived from living organisms. Because you notice as we're closing in to an explanation that can be useful, it's still not correct with regard to what we think of as correct in our time, in our place. And that leads to a more general formulation of how you go through the process of scientific reasoning and hypothesis testing. It's never going to get you to quote unquote uncomplicated truth that is definite. Because as we go through life, not just us individually, but as we build on the knowledge of generations past, and we get more detailed knowledge, we are going to change and refine our statements of belief and hypothesis. So sometimes, of course, it's straightforward, just like when he only had to think through why an atmospheric hypothesis would be incorrect. But a lot of times it's not that simple. So if we have this generalized formula about how to think about refining and testing our hypothesis, it can help us to understand whether or not in those complicated situations our hypothesis really makes sense or not. So always look to the observable results. If H, my hypothesis, is true, then so is I, right? So if my hypothesis that an atmospheric condition causes this disease, then it must be that people are outside contract the disease. The evidence, though, shows that I is not true. The women didn't contract disease when they gave birth outside. That means the hypothesis is not true. So always look at the expected observable results. So then, on the opposite side, if H is true, then so is I. So if cadaveric matter is what's causing this disease, then washing hands should stop it. It shows that it's true, H is true. But we also know that one piece of evidence isn't enough to really say that we believe H is 100% true. It just lends a percentage of evidence. And then you have the more generalized formula over here. If H is true, then so are I1, I2, I to N. So there might be 50 expected observable results. And if they all end up being true, then we have a much greater possibility of H actually being true. I was thinking that I have no way of knowing if there are questions about this material, and I'll put this up on Blackboard as well. But I was thinking you could start to ask me questions in the YouTube comments if anything that I'm talking about isn't as clear as it could be.